posted. But we're really happy today to welcome back Dr. Joel Suss from the Bank of England, but also a visiting fellow here at Case and also at the International Inequalities Institute at LSE. Just a reminder for those online, Tammy Campbell is there if you have any points of clarification or any questions that you want to add in for the end, just let Tammy know and she can help you with that. But just to move on now, so I'll introduce Joel to everybody. So Joel is a research data scientist in the Advanced Analytics Division at the Bank of England. He did his PhD here at LSE in the Department of Psychological and Behavioural Science and finished a couple of years ago in 2021. His work uses large data sets and computational methods to measure economic inequality at granular spatial levels. An example of this is bringing together house price data and small area income estimates to measure inequality at the neighbourhood level. So using local measures to better approximate how inequality is experienced, Joel's research explores the consequences of economic inequality for social and economic behaviours. And a study co-authored with Tiago Oliveira provides evidence of a link between this neighbourhood inequality in London and volume of police stop and search activity. And today, Joel is going to talk to us about local economic inequality and household borrowing in the UK. So I'll hand over to Joel now.
Great, thanks a lot. Good to be back. Well, here, I'm a visiting fellow, and actually this piece of work is the reason I come into Case. So I have access to some data which I can only use here at Case. Started this project during my PhD sitting at Case, but because of COVID, couldn't actually access the data. So glad to finally be working on it, getting into a state where it's almost there. So really looking forward to your guys' comments. So I should say also, I'm visiting fellow here and I work at the Bank of England. So there's a disclaimer that anything I say here is my own view and not the Bank of England's. Okay, so let me motivate this topic. Why am I looking at inequality and borrowing? I mean, here's two figures. On the left is the household debt to income ratio for the UK, aggregate household debt and over income. And we see, like, since the 1990s, this huge increase in that ratio up until the financial crisis. So that's the shaded bar there. After which that's the peak, and then it declines and stagnates at around 130. And then on the right is economic inequality, which I guess we're kind of used to the trends here. UK economic inequality measured by the Gini coefficient. Also in the preceding few decades, there's been a big increase in inequality up until the financial crisis, and then as with the aggregate debt, there's a decline and stagnation. So really, the connection between these two is a really policy relevant topic, and something I'm going to address here. And of course, it's something that's going to address in the US primarily. So the figure on the right here is from a paper by Cobion et al. And it shows the same figures for the US data, different measure of inequality, the log of the 90-10 ratio, and also household debt to GDP. So in the US also, there's been this big increase in both those trends. And so the theory here, some prominent, there's a book by Rajan and then a paper by Kumhoff et al. The theory really being that rising inequality causes increased household debt, which then precipitates financial crisis and precipitated the financial crisis.
So just a clarification,
Yeah.
Is it housing debt as well? Debt.
I think it's all debt. Yeah.
All debt, okay.
So in these theories, really, there's two sort of strands. There's a demand side and a supply side. So the demand side is that households, especially those on the lower end, are demanding more credit because of inequality rising. Those on the rich can consume more, and those who are disadvantaged by inequality need to borrow to sort of match that consumption, to keep up with their relatively richer peers. There's also a supply side argument, and this is the Kumhof paper, where inequality causes excessive savings by richer households. They just have more money, which they save, and then that is then fed back in the form of cheaper credit to lower income households. So both these demand and supply side arguments suggest there's a negative interaction between income and inequality for household borrowing. So lower income households borrow more when inequality is high. So that's theory, but actually there's a number of empirical papers, and the findings are mixed here. So generally, there's people take a panel of countries, look at the aggregate inequality, aggregate debt, and indicators of financial crises, and do some regressions on using this panel of countries. And there's very mixed results. There's one figure here from the paper by Bordeaux, which finds no relationship between lending and changes in inequality. So figure just shows us, for two countries, the USA and France, from 1920 to 1939, there's a quite messy relationship. Sometimes there might coincide these two, the change in loans and change in inequality. But in other circumstances, like for France, in the later part of this period, those two diverge. So their evidence is contrary to this theory about the link. So how do we break through here and try to understand whether there is a relationship between inequality and debt? Well, what I'm going to do is refocus the attention, and this is actually the sort of theme of my PhD. When I did my PhD for different areas, focus attention on the micro level. So rather than aggregate debt, household borrowing behavior, and looking at not macro measurements of inequality, but local measurements of inequality. So I'll first just explain why local rather than macro measurements of inequality are important. So the question here really is whether macro level inequality is an appropriate treatment, as many scholars use the sort of country level inequality as a sort of the experience or the treatment of inequality for households. But actually, we have a lot of evidence that inequality is experienced locally. So this is a case I make in a paper that is part of my PhD. There's a lot of work in social psychology, political science, sociology about the experiences of inequality in a local level. So social comparisons are made in a local level. Social contact, formation of friendship networks, social observation. This all happens in a local setting rather than a macro setting. Relatedly, macro level inequality lacks salience. So if you ask people, how much inequality is there in the UK, they get that answer very wrong. They're they really misunderstand the level of inequality in society. And at the same time, those perceptions of inequality are crucial for driving behavior. So they get it wrong, and the fact that they get it wrong is important. And then also I show, related to these arguments is just the idea that that I show here on the right. This is in a paper also in my PhD looking at US data. If you take a macro level aggregate measure of inequality, you're really just obscuring this wide variation of more local inequality. So here's within state inequality. So the red dot is the state level Gini. And then all those other black dots are the zip code area Gini coefficients, more localized, better proxies for communities. And you can see there's a huge range for each of these states. So really in studies that take these aggregate entities, spatial units, there's this huge variation of actual lived experience of inequality. Okay, so household borrowing and local inequality. So actually, this is, there's actually a paper exactly on this using US data. But I'm obviously still working on this research topic, although there's this, I would say, important paper out there on the topic using US data. This paper finds the opposite, the complete opposite of this theory. Instead of a negative interaction between income and inequality, it finds a positive interaction between local inequality and income for household borrowing in the US. And here's the figure, the main figure in their paper. I don't know if you can see these numbers so well. Basically, for different percentiles, they're plotting the debt to income ratio, or the sort of expected debt to income ratio. So at the top line is the 80th percentile. So their debt to income ratio increases over time as inequality increases, and the reverse for the 20th percentile. So this is very counterintuitive relative to the theory, and the reason I'm exploring this paper in detail is because I think there's some important issues here, which means it needs to be revisited. So the most important issue is really they don't have income. They don't observe income for their data. They have to impute it. They impute income for using some regression, fitted regression, and then they base their measure of inequality on that imputed income. And so it's not clear, they're taking percentiles. It's not clear how good their sort of imputation model is. Actually, they don't show any performance analysis of their imputation. And then what they take as their dependent variable is the debt to income for this 2002 to 2012 period, using as the denominator the imputed income for 2001. So with better data, which I have, I'm going to show you from the UK, I think this could be revisited. They actually find that they look at whether this is demand or supply driven, and they argue that it's actually their findings are supply driven. So banks are charging higher rates of interest to lower income households. So it's not the demand side is not a factor. It's actually really the credit supply of banks in these local areas which are charging higher credit, which is why lower income households have less debt over this period. So there's other reasons why maybe we need more evidence here. It's a US study, very specific type of banking sector, more diffuse, many more regional banks. So the UK, which is a very different, more oligopolistic banking sector, nationwide type of banks, might be better evidence. So that's what I'm doing here. So I'm looking at the interaction between inequality and income for household borrowing using really granular data on economic inequality. So a paper I published a few months ago as part of my PhD has this local measure of inequality. And then using the wealth and asset survey from the ONS, very detailed observed household income and other balance sheet information. So so you can say better data than this US study because it has income. Okay, so the data. So this is the paper where I introduced this measure of inequality. It's based on housing values. The UK doesn't have granular data on income or wealth, so can't actually measure income or wealth inequality at granular levels. So I use housing as a proxy for income and wealth. And this paper, I also show that that's actually salient. People are more likely to perceive high inequality if there's inequality in housing prices. So housing prices does feed into their perceptions. As the main measure of inequality, I'm going to take the Gini coefficient in the main analysis and neighborhoods, so local level units. I'm going to take as the middle super output areas. So these are census defined boundaries, population weighted. So on average, 7,000 households per MSOA. Both of these definitions, I'm going to vary in robustness checks. So different spatial units and different measures of inequality. And here's a figure looking at the spatial distribution of inequality in London and all of the UK, missing a lot of data from Northern Ireland. So that's the main inequality stuff. Now for the definitions of borrowing and income. So from the wealth and asset survey, it's secure access. So I have these very granular geographical markers, MSOA and below actually. The main dependent variable is going to be like the Cobian et al. Paper, debt to income ratio. I'm going to take two measures here. So debt to income ratio conditional on a household having some debt. So just this positive debt value. And then also this binary, whether a household has any debt at all. So debt to income is above 0. Is this sort of 1 and 0 is the 0 category. And so maybe going back to your question. So I'm going to actually take away property debts. My measure of debt is going to be consumer debt.
Okay.
So total debt minus property debt. And actually, I'll show you later different debt items, including property debt, split out. So we could look at the difference between consumer debt and property debt. And also there's alternative dependent variables, debt to income above a threshold, which the wealth and asset survey defines as being high, the ratio 0.2. And then also there's questions that get at subjective experiences of debt. So a household that says they experience somewhat or a heavy burden of debt, I'm going to take that as a sort of burdensome debt and use that as a binary variable. And for income, I'm going to just take the gross household yearly income variable. Now, obviously, in the absence of some kind of experiment, there's the causal identification is difficult. Really here, all I can rely on is, very well-controlled study. So here are, think carefully about the control variables. I think, so there's a bunch of demographics of the household head, household level attributes, the size of the household, housing tenure, and also household wealth, which comes from the wealth analysis survey. And then local area characteristics, which are pretty important. So really one key variable is probably the cost of living for these local areas, which, higher cost of living, you probably have to borrow more if you're a lower income household in those areas. So in the main analysis, I'm going to proxy that with average house value. And I'll do different things to try to, robustness checks to try to kind of get at that cost of living control. And also going to include region and the survey weight fixed effects. So the methods, okay, so inequality over this period. So, I showed you the first graph was UK inequality. Actually, from the financial crisis onwards, it doesn't change all that much. It stagnates for most of the period. Wealth and asset survey, there isn't much variation since the start of the survey. It starts in 2006. First couple of waves can't be used given different variable collection in those waves. So really, you don't have much variation in inequality within households. So for each household, I'm taking the latest appearance. So it's basically a cross-section of households. That also I'm going to vary in robustness checks and two different things about when inequality is measured and which waves are used. But for the main analysis, this cross-section latest wave of appearance and the wave fixed effects will be included. And then the main model is this random intercept model. So we've got households nested in areas. And then this, lots of controls, random intercept here for the area and SOA level. And what we care about is this interaction term. So this gamma coefficient on the interaction. Okay, so now let me get into the results. Okay, so I'm going to just show you a series of coefficient plots instead of tables. These are all for full models, so all controls included. I'm just going to show you the key variable coefficients. And then I'm going to, it's the interaction is what we care about. And, it's hard to interpret an interaction effect, so I'll show you interaction plots in a second. So for different outcome measures, here's where the debt to income greater than 0. That's the dependent variable, it's binary. And we have a negative and significant interaction term. So the point is the point estimate, and then the confidence interval here. So really what this is saying is lower income households are more likely to be in debt, to have some debt when inequality is high. And so, yeah, the interaction plot, to better interpret how this is, what this looks like for different income levels. So the different colors are different income levels. It's all standardized. So 0 is the mean income. And then in standard deviations above and below the mean income. So the yellow is like the highest, the 3 standard deviations above the mean and 3 standard deviations below. And then so what happens to the predicted probability of having debt as we vary inequality away from its mean also. So comparing the interaction model and then the model with the full model without the interaction term. So here in every, the higher income households are more likely to have debt, but as we vary inequality, lower income households are much more likely to have debt in high areas of inequality versus low areas of inequality. So the absolute values of these predicted probabilities aren't really actually should be interpreted because it just depends on how we fit the model, what value all the other variables we choose. Here it's just the median value for all the continuous variables and just arbitrary decisions, but really it's the relative difference in predicted probability. So here we're about 20 percentage point different from 3 standard deviations below to 3 standard deviations above. 20 percentage point increase in the probability of having debt for low income households. I mean, this is the starkest for the lowest, and then when you get close to the mean, it's not as many percentage points. And the reverse is true for higher income households. Now, just for the debt to income, conditional on having some debt. So again, we have this negative significant interaction term. So lower income households have higher debt to income ratios when local inequality is high. And then again, the fitted interaction plot here, it's actually the lower income households who have in general a higher debt to income ratio, regardless of the area. And much higher, I mean, it depends on the level of inequality. So the lowest group here has way higher predicted debt to income ratio in areas of high inequality. And actually, higher income households have slightly lower debt to income ratios as you vary inequality. Now we could look at other dependent variables. So here's above this high threshold, we still have this negative coefficient. We still see, the same kind of, here's how we fit it, the same kind of trends depending on income groups. So higher income households are way less likely to be above this critical or this high threshold. Lower income households are way more likely to have, I guess you could call it problem debt or excessive debt in areas of high inequality. And they're also more likely, lower income households, to subjectively experience burdensome debt. So when we asked people about their debt levels, income and inequality interact again negatively. So you're way more likely to, if you're a low income household in an area of high inequality, experience burdensome debt. Okay, so those are like the main results. There's a bunch of robustness checks, different geographical levels. I'm going to try to skip over this a bit. Different geographical levels, doesn't really matter what level we choose, except for if we go to more aggregated levels of, so local authority districts, that's LAD, where actually this disappears, but for travel to work areas, which are also aggregate areas, we still have this negative coefficient. This is for the first dependent variable above or below 0 debt. We can also look at relative income. So, I had as the main income measure, gross income. So for everybody it's gross income, but we actually have estimates from the ONS for SOA average income. So we could take each household's income minus the average income of the MSOA to have a relative for their area income level, and still see these negative coefficients for both main dependent variables. Other specifications. So this cost of living question is probably the sort of key control variable you want to think about. So there's two things actually. So instead of region fixed effects, I've included local authority fixed effects. So these are way more, there's 300 of those versus 12 regions. So now if you include the local authority fixed effects, it's variation in inequality within a local authority area. So you might think of local authorities varying in terms of cost of living. And so including that control, you're getting that more local cost of living, you're taking that out. I also included index of multiple deprivation as maybe a proxy for cost of living. And also I varied the inequality measure. So here's the table for inequality measure. Doesn't matter if you take the top 1% or different ratios. For each of these measures, there's a negative interaction term. So including all controls and yeah. Another thing I do, we might think there's some issues with these are just associations. You could try to get closer to a causal sort of story by doing something like matching. So this is coarse exact matching. So I take households which are just alike on everything that we can observe, all the control variables basically. And the only difference between these households is whether they live in an area of above or below average inequality. So we're matching them on observables. smaller sample size when you do this, and still there's a negative interaction between the income and treatment here. So I'm not saying this is causal. There's still some sort of threats to causality, which I'll discuss towards the end. But it's getting rid of all observations which don't have a match in a sort of low or high inequality neighborhood. Okay, so that's a bunch of robustness. Now, trying to tease apart what is sort of driving this. At the start, I said there's two possible channels that have been theorized: the demand or supply. Here, I'm decomposing the debt to income ratio in terms of its items that you have in wealth and asset survey. So for each of these columns, it's regression where instead of debt to income, consumer debt to income, it's each of these debt items to income. So overdrawn, HP is hire purchase, car debts, credit cards, store cards, student loans, informal loans, loans from families or friends, formal loans, so any kind of personal loan from a bank, and then actually property, which again wasn't included in the sort of main specification, but I'm also just listing here as a separate item. So this is for whether you have some debt or no debt, so the binary outcome measure. Same results for the other dependent variables. So basically we see the interaction is nothing for overdrawn, but for, and some of these are only significant at the 10% level, but for hire purchase, credit cards, and formal loans, there's a negative and significant coefficient on the interaction term. So each of these channels is contributing to the sort of main results, you could say. This doesn't really help us when looking at credit cards or formal loans. If you think it's like a cost of living that's driving, the need to borrow more, then credit cards, that might show up in credit cards. You have to, borrow more from your credit cards because you have a higher cost of living. But hire purchase is one where actually maybe you think, is independent of cost of living, because it doesn't matter which area you live in. Your decision on how much to borrow for a car is not driven by the cost of living. Does that make sense? I don't know if I said that so well. But it's a choice. It's more of a choice here. Independent of cost of living. That's the argument I'm trying to make. So that's evidence of a demand channel, I would say. So lower income households are more likely to borrow against a car in areas of high inequality. That's what this negative interaction term is saying for the hire purchase product. For property, actually, the sign is flipped. Significant sign is flipped is a positive interaction. So lower income households are less likely to borrow in areas of high inequality, controlling for all other variables. So there's something very different about property, and property is obviously a very different form of debt. It's like, depends on when you take out your mortgage, the terms. You take out, one big loan in your life, maybe, whereas this consumer stuff is more, so more on demand, driven by needs. So yeah, evidence of a demand channel, I think, here. Okay, so that's we're about half an hour in, so that's the sort of end of the results, basically. And there's obviously a number of discussion points, so I'm gonna raise a few of them here. Just leading off on that last slide, demand or supply. So I think there is some evidence that the relationship is demand driven, given this hire purchase negative interaction term. Unfortunately, there's no data that I have that can address the supply side, really. Wealth and Asset Survey has the price of your mortgage debt, if you have a mortgage, the interest rate, but it doesn't have that for other forms of credit. So that might be some way of getting a supply if lower income households face different interest rates depending on where they live. There's not much reason to think so in the UK, because usually, I don't know if you apply for credit, but you do it online. There's like an algorithm. You do supply your postcode, so it's not clear what is driving sort of credit decisions. They're automated. Area might be part of it, but yeah. Anyways, I don't have any data here to talk about the supply side, but there does seem to be some evidence that's demand driven in the results. So the causal stories, I mean, this is obviously a big one. You can't experiment with households. You can't randomly allocate them to different neighborhoods with different levels of inequality. There might really, the results are associational, might be driven by selection effects. One possible story here is that, like, if you're upwardly mobile household, you have lower income, but you plan to have higher income. You prefer maybe to live in areas that are more unequal, to be around people who you want to be like, who are richer, and you might therefore also borrow more. So that's a possible story. Don't have any observable characteristics, variables. And the Wealth and Assets Survey to address that, but that's obviously a threat, and the coarse exact matching doesn't address that. I don't have anything to be able to address that possible selection effect. So really that's the end of this research here. There's some further research to undertake to really, here's some evidence I'm presenting, but clearly we need more evidence, other contexts, different data, longer time periods, ideally panel data for households. We can also think about policy implications. I mean, if you believe the story about demand side inequality affecting demand for credit, there's some implications to think about. One of them is around mixed community planning and development. I mean, this was big policy here in the UK and elsewhere, where the idea was to have mixed income households living in the same neighborhood, and there's all sorts of potential benefits of this. The evidence is actually mixed for mixed community developments. Not clear whether it actually is good. Here's some evidence maybe you would think is contrary to a mixed community development. But there's obviously, this is one component of what mixed communities might involve. And actually, I have other evidence in different papers where there's a positive benefit of sort of mixing of different income households. And of course, there's an implication here of problem debt, maybe caused by inequality, local inequality. If that's the case, then there is some public outreach, some charities and policies oriented towards problem debt, which we need to think about, interventions which we might think about to make households aware and try to mitigate the sort of negative impacts of inequality in local settings. Right. Okay. So that's it. So thanks very much for your attention. So yeah, happy for all comments.
Thank you, Joel. That was very interesting. I'm really interested in the sort of informal borrowing side, because we did some qualitative work in Newham a few years ago on sort of debt and borrowing. And when we were asking people kind of where their first kind of port of call would be when they need, it was always kind of informal borrowing from friends and family. And obviously, I think that possibly wouldn't show up so much in a kind of official survey of whether people felt that they had debts and that kind of thing. Very interesting. Are there any questions in the room first, and then we'll go online?